chapter. We'll look eventually at verses 10 to 17 today. If you're in your pew Bibles, that's page 1516, 1517 is where it begins. Before we begin, though, let me just remind you, we've been going through the Gospel of Matthew, taking a look everywhere Jesus says these words, the kingdom of heaven, because we want to know what Jesus teaches about heaven. So we're taking our time to look through everything that he says in regards to this. And today, we see that Jesus begins, to teach in parables. The immediate context right before we read what we're going to read today, Jesus teaches the parable of the sower. If you know what a parable is, it's a story that helps to explain a more complex idea. It takes simple things and uses them to help draw our mind to a bigger, more complex reality. If you've ever read, I had to read it, I don't know, maybe it wasn't mandatory reading back then, but if you've ever read the book, George Orwell's book, The Animal Farm, that's a parable. It's a parable. It's about animals. It's about pigs that take over the farm and organize all the work of the animals. But it's really not about pigs and other barnyard animals. It's about communism and the dangers therein, and the way that the pigs who take over end up becoming the same sort of overlords that they overtook. Well, it's a parable. It uses simple things to explain a more complex idea. This is what Jesus is doing. He's using parables to teach the complexities of the kingdom of heaven, to draw our mind heavenward. The problem is, though, that Jesus is simply telling these stories and giving no explanation to them. And his disciples are sitting around while he's teaching these crowds that have gathered from all over. They've heard that Jesus can heal and that he can feed and cast out demons. And so he's drawing these big crowds, and they're all coming to Jesus for various reasons, and they're listening to Jesus teach. And his disciples are sitting in the audience going, "Gee whiz, Jesus, you're just telling these stories. We don't know what they mean. What are you doing?" And so they pull him aside and they say, "Hey, Jesus, nobody's really understanding what you're saying out there." And that's where we pick up today. Jesus responds to this criticism of his disciples. Nobody knows what you're saying, Jesus. Let's see what Jesus has to say himself. Matthew chapter 13, beginning in verse 10. The disciples came to him and asked, "Why do you speak to them people in parables?" And he replied, "The knowledge of the secrets of the kingdom of heaven has been given to you, but not to them." These are verses that teach us about God's grace, that we're saved really by God's grace. We only know and understand anything about heaven, about who Jesus is as the King of heaven, only because God has given us an understanding. And grace is something that is both humbling and really invigorating for us. It's humbling because we often want to think about salvation as having something to do with us, something that we've done to get it. I have these conversations with my dad all the time, who's a Methodist, and Methodists have a slightly different theology on this than we do. We still love our Methodist brothers and sisters, but we have a slightly different theology on this. And my dad, who's a Methodist pastor, says, "Yeah, son, Jesus offers salvation, but you've got to be the one to take it. You've got to be the one to accept it and choose Jesus." And I say, "No, Dad, if that's the case, then there's something that we do. We have a tendency as humans to want to have a part in our salvation, to say, I did that. I had a piece in that." But that's not at all what the scriptures teach. I know it's our tendency. We want to say, well, we do something for our salvation, but it's by grace alone. And if you're one of those people who struggles in that and says, "No, Pastor, I think that we have a little something to do with it," I'd encourage you, show me in the scriptures where that's the case, where you say, you'll be saved if you choose Jesus. Instead, here's what the Bible says. In John 15, verse 16, Jesus says, "You did not choose me. I chose you." Here's what Paul writes in the first chapter of the Ephesians. He says, "You were chosen in him before the foundation of the world, to be holy and blameless before him in love. You were predestined for adoption as sons." That's not John Pflug making up some crazy doctrine. That's what the Bible itself says. And so this begins to make a little bit more sense then, doesn't it, when we hear Jesus say, "The reason that you get to understand these parables, my disciples, is because to you the secrets of the kingdom of heaven have been given." God has given it to you as a gift, as grace. But then before we move on, we do have to deal with the more difficult other side of that coin, just maybe even for a moment. What about those other people? And I just confess a great mystery, that I don't know all the ins and outs of God's plan. But I know that at the end of verse 11, Jesus simply says this, to them it has not been given. That's it. I don't know the answer any more fully than that, except just to confess that God is a God whose mysteries we'll never be able to completely plumb because he's God. We continue then reading in verse 12. Whoever has will be given more, and he will have in abundance. And whoever does not have, even what he has will be taken from him. I wonder what Jesus is talking about. What is it that we have? I think there's an easy way to misread this. You could say, a prosperity gospel could make a heyday with a verse like this. He who has a car and is faithful with his car, God will give him more cars. He who has a house and treats it well and takes care of it, God will give him a bigger house. He who has money, God will give him more money. Is that what Jesus is saying here? I don't think so. Well, then what is it that he's talking about? He who has will be given more. What is it that he's talking about that we would have? And I think the answer is Christ himself. He who has Christ, he who has a love and a desire for the Lord, even more will be added to him. Not necessarily material prosperity, but the things that we long to grow in, to be more and more like Jesus. This is granted to us, and it should be a great hope for us, because if we look at our lives honestly, we say there's a lot lacking. I'm not talking about material, I'm talking about there's a lot lacking in my own growth. I'm not the person that I know Christ has called me to be. And it can be despairing, can it? To say, look at all the ways when I fall short. But if you can say at least this, I trust Jesus more than anything, and I long for him, then this verse can give us comfort. That he who has will be given in more abundance. As long as you can hold on to Christ as that core, as that one thing you want more than anything else, then all this growth, all this, the word that we use in the Christian circles is sanctification, all this growth in the Lord will be added to you. But he who has not, even what he has will be taken from him. He who has not, even what he has will be taken from him. It reminds me that everything we gain in this life is fleeting, and it helps us consider where we put our priorities. I have a bucket of change in my house, as I'm sure many of you do too. You come in from the day and you empty your pockets, put all the change in the bucket. I was looking through that bucket of change the other day, mostly quarters, nickels, dimes, pennies, but I found a couple of things that normally wouldn't be in a bucket. Well, they would, I guess, but I found a Korean won. I went to Korea a few years ago, and I came back with a Korean won there in the bucket, and then there was also a couple of Chuck E. Cheese coins from Chuck E. Cheese. And I got to thinking about that and thinking, one of these has value somewhere, not here. You couldn't go to Walmart and buy something with a Korean won. You certainly couldn't go to Walmart and buy it with Chuck E. Cheese coins. But they have value in a certain context. However, as I hold them in my hand, I realize that they're basically worthless at this point in time. When we get to heaven, what we'll find is that everything we have estimated by the reckoning of this world is so valuable. All the time and sweat and effort and money that we've put into making our house just the way that we want it to be, and building up that great big savings account and having all these nice things, I think we're going to find, like in a bucket of change, that everything that we have hoped would be so important to us in this life becomes ultimately like Chuck E. Cheese coins. I mean, it won't have a value in heaven. Now, that's not to say there aren't things that are valuable in heaven. There are. There are things that are eternally valuable, and people coming to know the Lord. We have an opportunity to invest now in things that will be eternal by speaking of the Lord and sharing his grace and sharing his mercy, and those things will last in eternity. But the things that we reckon as far as the world's concerned, there'll come a point in time where they'll be worthless and even taken from us. Jesus says, he who doesn't have even what he has will be taken from him. Let's continue then. In verse 13, this is why I speak to them in parables. Though seeing, they do not see. Though hearing, they do not hear, nor understand. In them is fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah. You will be ever hearing but never understanding. You will be ever seeing, but never perceiving, for this people's heart has become calloused. They hardly hear with their ears, and they have closed their eyes. Otherwise they might see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and turn, and I would heal them. This is a quote that Jesus gives us from the prophet Isaiah. BB read it earlier. And Isaiah is an interesting book, and if you're familiar with the book, this comes from the calling portion of Isaiah, when God calls Isaiah. And it's really a strange calling. It goes something sort of like this. Isaiah's coming in for the job interview, if you will, for prophet. And God says to Isaiah, well, Isaiah, are you worthy? And Isaiah says, no, I'm not worthy to be a prophet. I'm a man of unclean lips among a people of unclean lips. And God says, well, I'll make you worthy. And touches a coal to his lips to purify his speech. And then God says, well, are you ready for this job? And Isaiah says, well, what is it? He says, you're going to go to my people Israel, and you're going to tell them things, and they're not going to listen to you. And you're going to show them things, and they're not going to see it. I'm going to offer them healing, but nobody's going to accept it. You ready for the job? And Isaiah goes, no! But he's sent nonetheless. Actually, it's interesting that one of the hymns that we love comes from that. Here I am, Lord. I will go, Lord. You didn't know the rest of the story, though, that God's sending you to a people who are not going to listen, to a people who are you're going to show them things, but they're not going to see. And why is that? Well, it's because in Isaiah's time in particular, the people of Israel had hearts that had become calloused. That's what the scriptures tell us, that their hearts had become calloused. In the Greek, it's a word that can also mean fat, like there's tissue built up around it. That's what a callus is, but it also means to become fat. Their hearts had become fat. In other words, they'd become so comfortable and okay with their lives that they didn't need God. We have houses. We have food. We have stuff stored away. What do we need God for? Now, of course, they wouldn't say that. They're the people of the Lord. But what they ended up doing with their lives is living like they didn't need Him. They didn't need God. And so when the prophet came saying, you need God, they say, what are you talking about, Isaiah? Yeah, of course, we worship God, sure. But really, they didn't live their lives like they needed God. Their hearts had become fat. And as a result, eventually in Isaiah's time, the people of Israel were taken captive. They were destroyed. God allowed that to happen for exactly this reason, allowed their land to become desolate for this reason, because they rejected God. Their hearts had been fat and they didn't need Him anymore. And so the people were carried off into slavery. And so Jesus brings this verse forward today, though, and fulfills in our hearing. We should be careful too. We hear these words, you'll be ever hearing but never understanding, ever seeing but never perceiving. Why? Maybe because our hearts have become fat. I hope that's not the case. I pray and beg that that's not the case, but let's be honest, in the most wealthy country on the face of the planet, it is at least a real danger, isn't it? That we can get to a point where we say, where do we need God for? I've got a bank account full of money. I've got a house that's fully repaired and good to go. I've got insurance. What do I need God for? I'm not laying that accusation at anyone's feet here today, but I'm giving this warning, as I think Isaiah is, that we can easily get to a point where we live our lives like we don't even need God anymore. Our hearts can become fat, and so preachers stand up Sunday after Sunday saying, we need God! And you say, oh, come on, preacher, yeah, we got God. Do we live our lives like we need Him? Like we long for Him? Are we willing to hear what God says and see what He shows us? Or are our hearts calloused? I'm not trying to wag the finger too hard. Quite frankly, I know full well that after the sermon's over today, I'm going to go home and I'm going to eat some good food. I'm going to relax on a nice couch and I'm going to watch my Cowboys play. So it's hard to point the finger, isn't it? I guess what I'm saying is this, though. And I wouldn't say that that's bad stuff to do. God gives us all these things for our enjoyment. It would be a slap in the face if God gave us these wonderful things to enjoy and then we just sort of sat in sackcloth and ashes and Said, oh, I'm so terrible, I don't enjoy. We need to enjoy the blessings that God's given us. But I guess what I'm saying is this, that if at the end of the day, when you finish watching your Cowboys play and you're full of food, if you're not fundamentally asking this question, God, isn't there something else? This doesn't finally fill me. Lord, I long for you. If the end of the day, if that little voice isn't spurring you on to Christ, then I wonder if the words of this prophet aren't coming true in us. I pray, though, that the Spirit would not leave us alone, would not leave us satisfied in the trappings of this life, but press us to Christ. And when that happens, then these words become true. What Jesus says in 16 and 17, but blessed are your eyes because they see, and your ears because they hear. For I tell you the truth, many prophets and righteous men longed to see what you see, but did not see it, and hear what you hear, but did not hear it. Jesus is saying that there have been people from all generations and all times that have longed, as I just mentioned, longed for something more than they could find in all this life. Solomon wrote it so well in Ecclesiastes. He had all the women and all the pleasures, all the money, all the houses that he could imagine, and still he said, vanity of vanities. All the righteous men have longed for something else that can't be satisfied with anything this world offers. And Jesus says, blessed are your eyes, because guess what? They've all waited for it, but you've seen it. Seen what, Jesus? Where is it? It's in Him. It's in Christ. He is the one that we've been waiting for. He's the one that fills that void. The longing for significance and meaning is found for us in the person of Jesus Christ. There are many people who are looking for their significance elsewhere, and all these parables block them out. They say, oh yeah, Jesus is just talking about some sower, some wheat, some grass. But Jesus is talking about something so much more. And for you who see Him, you know that you find your satisfaction ultimately and finally in Him. Blessed are your eyes, for they see, and your ears, for they hear what righteous men and women have longed to see and to hear. May this word be to the glory of God and for the joy of His people. Amen.